Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name's James Harding, and when I was at the BBC, the complaint against me, one of many, was that I had a real soft spot for stories that had no pictures. And there's nothing like a story about inflation or money supply or interest rates or asset prices to be a story that has bad pictures. But I'd just like to say that at Tortoise, we've gone one better than dealing with these stories with no pictures. We've put them to music. And I hope you'll agree that there's never been a more upbeat intro to an inflationary period than you've had over the last 90 seconds. The wise souls that are joining us, Liam and Vicky and Jack, I can see grinning. It's far better than a kind of somber intro to a real wage crisis that you'll get on Newsnight. So thank you all for joining us. I'll tell you that this. I just said to all three of them before we got started that I'm unhealthily interested and excited by this subject, because when we set up Tortoise, one of the ideas was, how do you understand the things that are driving the news rather than just chase the things that are breaking news? And this subject feels like one that we really do need to understand. It's going to affect how we live, work and wages, house prices, savings, but also our politics too. And so the aim of this thinking is to try and come away with a bunch of notes from which we can inform our sense makers, commission slow views, even think about future slow newscast podcasts. So I'm going to scribble away most of the time. But I'm going to start, if I might, with Liam Byrne. We're joined, everyone should see, Liam Byrne, Vicky Price, Jack Leslie. I'm going to introduce you each in turn rather than do that kind of toe curling thing at the top. I'm going to do the toe curling thing through the whole event. And Liam, the reason I'm so appreciative of you being here is that I don't feel anyone's really talking about what happens to politics when you're in an inflationary period, partly because people like you and me have actually lived most of our adult lives in a low interest rate, low inflation environment. And so think about government, think about things differently. But whether it's as an MP or whether it's from your time in the Treasury, tell us what you think will happen to politics if, and I know it's something of an if, inflation gets baked in for the next few years.
Well, thank you. So I think that is the big if, and I don't think we yet know the answer to that. So knowing that I was coming on, I was sort of talking to some constituents outside Aldi in the Fox and Goose on Friday about what I should say here tonight, and we did a bit of a chat on Facebook as well. And it's quite obvious from a street level political point of view. This is not yet a really significant worry. So lots of people kind of said to me, well, you'd expect prices to begin rising now, wouldn't you? People have just come off furlough. Savings were high for a certain group of people. The savings rate, I think, went up to something like the highest level since records began in 1987. As unlock began to start, it's not a surprise that there was a demand jump, and you saw the effects that you then had. I mean, the people who are really feeling it now are the people who are on universal credit, people who are carers. But oddly enough, we're not getting the same kind of kickback about, for example, petrol prices that we did a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. So I think we're in the early stages of this. And obviously, as you say, the big debate is this sharp spike up in prices, is it basically going to break the anchors of price expectations? So that's obviously a disaster when that happens. You start getting inflationary wage pushes. It all becomes a bit kind of tricky. And I think there are actually some good reasons to worry about whether that is going to happen in Britain. So basically whether the expectation anchors are going to snap. And that's partly because we've got a competition regime that doesn't work in this country. So a couple of years ago, the IMF looked at what they call price markups. They were looking at basically proxies for monopoly power within the market economy. And what was very, very striking is that the markups in the UK were a hell of a lot worse than the global averages, which just speaks to the fact that we've got a competition regime that doesn't really work anymore. And therefore, you've got some big companies with a lot of market power to raise prices. Obviously, the bodging of Brexit means that we've got supply chain problems that are a lot more pronounced than elsewhere. You've got traders wrapped up in red tape. You don't have to go very far in the West Midlands before you hear manufacturers tell you about having to shut down factory floors because they can't get stuff through at the border. And our labour market is really problematic. You know, we've got a training system that doesn't work, and you see that in a place like Birmingham. So, you know, I serve the constituency with the highest unemployment in Britain, and right now we've got sky-high unemployment in, say, East Birmingham at the same time as we've got lots and lots of vacancies. But when all of that is said and done, Britain being Britain, the politics will bite when it bites older voters, because overwhelmingly older voters have the balance of power in Britain. We don't like to say this very much, but to a degree we live in a gerontocracy. The Labour majority, for example, we'd lose the older people's vote by 3 million. So the Tory majority amongst older voters is 3 million. And this is where the politics may really bite next April, because, you know, the Tories obviously decided to hold down pension rises to 3.1%. It's just over £4. But the Bank of England is saying inflation may well be over 5% next spring.
Right.
So that is when you're going to start to get a cut in the living standards for a lot of older voters for the first time in a long time. And just the sheer weight of older voters in the voting market, you know, maybe 40% of the people who actually go and vote are in their 55 and above range. That's when the politics is really going to begin to get quite dangerous for the Conservatives, I think.
Liam, that's really interesting, and I see there are a lot of really kind of plugged in people on this in this conversation. So I want to try and bring in as many as possible. But before I go to Vicky, Liam, can I just ask you one other thing, which is about life inside the Treasury? You know, people who followed the Treasury, followed you, know well about your time there. I suppose I've always been interested, when you arrive as a minister in government, there's this sense that the Treasury has a certain mindset, an approach, and tries to, if you like, inculcate in the ministers those kinds of concerns. And I just wondered whether you'd, if you like, project for us what the Treasury's resting heartbeat will be like in a world where prices are rising, there's the real risk of interest rates increasing, and how they will think about debt and spending as a result of that. What the constraints on Rishi Sunak and his team are going to be from the institution of the Treasury.
That's a great question, and funnily enough, I mean, you're beginning to see that battle already shape up between number 11 and number 10. So, you know, the Treasury is programmed to tell people that there is no money. You know, that is that. You know, it's not just what we write in leaving notes. I mean, that is the House view. It's not just an economic department; it's also the Department of Finance for the country. So it is always worried about spending money. It takes its role as a Department of Finance in a way much more seriously than it takes its role as a Department for Economics and economic growth, frustratingly enough, for many people. But, you know, the real anxiety will be that, you know, we've got fiscal frameworks that change every 10 minutes at the moment. I think we're on our, 7th or 8th fiscal framework in recent years. And, you know, the Treasury is basically paranoid, overly paranoid about a gilt strike, you know, not being able to sell their bonds because, you know, we do have to sell an awful lot of them every day, every week. So the Treasury likes to have fiscal frameworks that project market confidence so that bonds can be sold as cheaply as possible, but will now be kind of really worried about the prospects of rising interest rates, rising debt payments. I'm sorry,
Liam, forgive me. I don't understand what that is. How does a gilt strike work?
So they will basically so they live in kind of fear that at a bond auction, at a gilt auction, basically, they won't be able to sell all the gilts that they're trying to sell, or they will be having to sell those gilts at a price that is higher than it might otherwise be. And it was, I just remember being, you know, in the Treasury on a couple of different occasions when I was there, where, you know, people were sort of giving each other an updated sort of news feed from how the gilt auction was going that morning. I mean, it genuinely is something that civil servants worry about, unnecessarily in my view, but I mean, it's definitely part of the mindset and the psyche. And so people in the Treasury will be just super worried now about debt payments going up, and they will be even more anxious about the kind of spending culture that Boris Johnson is bringing to the Tory party.
And there's a point here, isn't there? I was on a call with Rishi Sunak a few weeks ago where the point that he was making is that the scale of the borrowing post-COVID means that combined with the amount of government borrowing that's linked to RPI, he was saying makes us now as the UK 6 times more exposed to increases in interest rates than we were even back in 2008-9. Does that ring a bell to you? Is that the kind of
government debt has doubled since we left office. So I mean, just the levels of public debt now are we thought I thought money was tight back in 2010. I mean, it's nothing compared to the fiscal situation now, and that's true. Right the way around the world, we've got debt levels globally that are now much more elevated. We have the good fortune to have a lot of our debt denominated in very long-term bonds. But there's no getting around it. With the prospect of rising interest rates, is going to bring on higher debt payments, and that is going to cut into the wiggle room that we've got to invest in other things that the Prime Minister might like to spend money on.
Liam, I'm going to come back to you, and please, anyone who's got a point to make, please do weigh in. I'm going to try and drag in a moment Douglas Flint, who I can see is here as the person I would normally go to try and help me find the answer to some of these questions. But I'm going to come to Vicky Price, if I might first. Vicky, can I ask you to sort of put on your it is your hat, but the economist hat, which is, have we already missed the boat here? Has the Bank of England, has the Fed even more so, missed the boat in terms of being able to contain or control inflation?
Not necessarily. I think it's very much a global phenomenon, as we know. I mean, we've had huge increases in energy prices that came up as a result of the fact that restrictions were eased for a while, at any rate. Of course, we're going back to having restrictions reimposed, but they were eased, and demand rose very, very significantly. And there have been huge supply constraints, mainly because if you just look at commodity prices, for example, or, mines across the world, which had shut either because of COVID or because manufacturing plants and mines were shut for a while and mothballed because demand had disappeared. Lots of manufacturers had simply cancelled orders. And then, of course, getting those companies back, those factories back into production, and also the mines and other commodity producers to produce what was required, has led to this incredible shortage, but also, of course, with it, an increase in prices. So we've got to bear that in mind, that just over a year ago, oil prices were negative.
Yeah.
Now they've gone back to pre-pandemic levels, and we worry hugely about that. But it's because demand has increased so significantly over a period of time when supply hasn't been able to respond. So it is a global phenomenon. So the idea that you will be having central banks raise their interest rates a bit and really control that is neither here nor there, really, because it isn't going to get you very far unless that it brings with it. In other words, you raise interest rates to such an extent that demand is seriously constrained across the world in a coordinated fashion. And it's worth bearing in mind that when we did have higher interest rates, I mean, admittedly, we're at record low levels now at 0.1% here in terms of the bank rate. When we did raise them after the financial crisis, the highest they reached in the previous decade was 0.75%. So I saw the slides earlier, which showed what would happen if interest rates went up by 1%, 2%, 3%. But the likelihood of anything like that happening anywhere in the sort of Western world is it's very, very small. That would take place.
Can I just ask you about that? Because I was on a call where one economist was saying, actually, we're consistently underestimating the likelihood of persistent inflation, i.e. there's been an argument through 2021 that this inflation is transitory, that it is a response to the post-pandemic, spike in demand. And we're underestimating that inflation gets baked in. And someone's pointing out to me that Bill Dudley, formerly of the New York Fed, was warning that interest rates could go up to 4 to 5% in the United States, was pointing out that inflation in the US is at now, 6%? 6%.
Yeah.
The Bank of England is forecasting inflation of 5%. And I suppose, Vicky, the thing that really shocked me was someone pointed me to the John Deere story, the story about the John Deere tractor business, where the workers there rejected a pay deal of 6%. And the company said, okay, fine, we're going to give you 10%. And they went back to work. And so the rise in prices got baked in as a rise in wages. And so isn't it feasible that we should start worrying at least about persistent inflation and then a big step change in interest rates?
I think what is true is that we have underestimated inflation this time around. There's no doubt about that. If you looked at any forecast of the IMF, any private institutions that do that, you would have found that the expectation for the UK was considerably less than what we're likely to see now. The expectation for the US, the same. The expectation for Germany, which has just announced inflation of over 5% as well. But there have been some contributory factors, as I said. It is the energy costs that are very, very significant. It's the fact that production of, say, motor cars has been affected negatively because we haven't had the semiconductors that have been needed for the new types of cars that we have. And what has happened is that secondhand car prices have gone up very significantly, and we've got that baked into the system as well. But of course, you're right that if it then translates into higher wages, which it has done in various places, then you will perhaps have that wage inflation feeding into more inflation that we have seen staying on for longer. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have considerably higher inflation, because a number of the factors that I've just mentioned are going to disappear from the equation at some point. So if you're just looking at year-on-year inflation at some point in the future, if you don't have the continuous price increases that we've recently seen, you're going to have quite a fall in inflation happening naturally anyway, which is, mathematically, that's what's going to happen. But there is also the element you said we have consistently underestimated. But if you look at the markets right now, in other words, yields for 10-year bonds, which is the one that we normally look at. I mean, I'm conscious of what Liam was saying earlier about not being able to sell bonds and worrying about it. The reality is, of course, that the markets reacted to the Omicron variant by dropping stocks and buying government bonds. So yields have come down again, if anything. I mean, in Germany, you can still sell 10-year bonds as a government at negative interest rates, minus 0.3. So, we are not in a situation where the markets think there's going to be rampant and persistent inflation. Certainly, if you look at yields, they don't think that. There is, though, another element. Interest rates are not the be-all and end-all. What governments have been doing is huge, of course, fiscal expansion, and they've been having to sell those gilts in order to be able to fund that fiscal expansion. And of course, we know that it's the central banks that have been buying them back from in the secondary market, so they've increased their balance sheets. Now, of course, they are beginning to reduce that. Certainly in the US, they're doing it. If you remember, they've been buying something like 120 billion worth of US dollars worth of bonds in the secondary market, treasury bills, every month since February, perhaps February or March 2020, which is huge. Now they're reducing it as of November, this month, which is just finishing, by 15 billion a month, which means that by June, if that continues and is yet less 15 to whatever we were, and fewer 15 again every month, by June we will have basically stopped buying, or the US would have stopped buying any bonds in the secondary market. So that is actually a serious squeeze alongside the fiscal squeeze that we're seeing actually happening, because nobody's going to be spending, even the US with the stimulus measures, anything like as much in stimulating the economies across the world as was done in 2020. So there will be a natural reduction in that sort of buying exuberance that we have seen recently.
And isn't it, and I suppose, Vicky, I guess one of the questions we've got here, we've got kind of, if you like, the kind of question from Liam's world, which is, how does inflation change the political dynamic? What you're touching upon, presumably, is a potentially huge change in market dynamics. Because if there was someone who was putting $120 billion into my wallet every month, you would start splashing money around, the asset prices, the value of everything would be rising.
It's exactly what's happened.
Which is exactly what's happened, right?
Houses across the world up, for example.
Exactly. So you've got a boom in the housing market everywhere. In fact, you've got crazy prices for a load of things. And as you say, you've got huge amount of liquidity, huge amount of cash going in to buy government bonds. Just paint us a picture of what happens in June when that money is no longer sluicing into the markets. What shakes out then?
well, there's going to be an awful lot less liquidity floating about. The banks aren't going to have quite as much cash as they had before, so they're going to have to be quite, a lot more careful in terms of what they give as loans to everybody. And so there is a tightening. So the monetary, or the liquidity that was there, it gets reduced quite significantly. And of course, at the same time, as you're selling, as you're selling the bonds that the central banks, the Federal Reserve in that case, has on its balance sheet, then prices come down and yields go up. So in the process of doing so, you are raising long-term interest rates, which basically means it's much more expensive to borrow for mortgages in the long term. Businesses that want to borrow will find, for investment, will find it more expensive to do so. So that acts very much as the withdrawal, if you like, of the stimulus that was given before, and therefore it will naturally slow the economy down. And that's what the expectation is. Now, they have tried to do that before and did, in fact, started or threatening it. And of course, the real problem is that what happened is the exchange rate goes up. So the dollar sort of strengthened, and quite a lot of emerging markets that had borrowed or had their debt denominated in US dollars found themselves practically, in default position. And so it was sort of stopped. So there is a problem about the dollar in particular being, of course, a reserve currency and one that is being used a lot for borrowing, and that's going to be an issue which might be affecting quite a lot of other countries, not just what's going on in the US.
Vicky, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I just want to ask Jack Leslie, because we've done a few politics, markets, macro. What about people? Jack Leslie, if you don't know, is at the Resolution Foundation, which is, I know it's pathetic, but I am a fan of a think tank. I know most people have football clubs. I've got the Resolution Foundation. And so, Jack, what do you think happens to people who does get exposed in the way that Liam touched upon when you get into a more concerted period of inflation?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. So the sort of the starting point is that everyone experiences inflation. Anyone that's gone to the petrol pump has seen it, but it's kind of really across the economy. So it's not necessarily people sort of seeing different rates of inflation, but what we know is that people who are on lower incomes, maybe already struggling to get by, the rise in their cost of living kind of immediately starts hitting things that kind of matter. So you start having to make difficult decisions about what you're spending money on. Are you heating your home? Are you being able to sort of do a full shop every week? So it is people on those low incomes that are going to be hardest hit. And I think it's also important to kind of bring in the broader context that's happening to household incomes. So we've had the withdrawal of the universal credit uplift that was really important during the pandemic. So for there have been some other changes as well, but for the average universal credit claimant, there's quite a significant reduction. They've had quite a significant reduction in their income in October, and we're going to go into a period where taxes are rising quite a lot. So if for working families, national insurance is going up next year, and all of that, you've got that kind of double whammy of costs are rising at the same time as you've got that rising in taxes, and so we're going to kind of see basically poorer working households hardest hit.
But can I ask you, is there also a weird thing that happens, Jack, which is the inequality gap narrows? That when you have inflation, it dents the value of assets at the top, it forces wage rises, across the economy, and overall, the big structural, chasm of inequality, as it's appeared to many people in the last decade, actually doesn't disappear, of course, but narrows a bit.
So I think there are a few things to unpick in there. If we're talking about kind of gaps in inequality in kind of wages and income, I think you probably don't really get a narrowing in the sense that, last time we had high inflation, so inflation after the financial crisis hit 5%. what we got was a kind of a decade of lost wages. We saw kind of big real wage falls at the same time as if you're on kind of if you're a pensioner, your incomes were protected, and so there was a stretching, at least intergenerationally, sort of across incomes. So if that holds again, and I think that's probably the most likely thing that we're going to see, within the next year, real wage falls. You actually might see inequality get a bit worse. I think wealth is potentially a bit different. So we have very large gaps in wealth across the country. It's about twice as unequal. If you use the Gini coefficient, a good measure of inequality as income, so about twice as unequal. If we do see rises in interest rates, and that's what Vicky was explaining, that would start affecting asset prices, and so you would get a kind of compression of the wealth distribution where if you own £1 million house and interest rates go up and we see a fall of 10%, say, that those are just numbers completely picked out of the air. If you own a £1 million house, you lose £100,000 on your 10% fall. If you don't own a house, you're low wealth, you're not seeing any reduction in your wealth, and so there's a mechanical reduction in wealth gaps. So I think it's quite complicated to know exactly how it will play out, but possible.
Jack, I'm going to come back to you in a second, because there's a conversation that's been going on about, for example, the housing prices, who's housing market, who's in and who's not. I do want to bring in Doug Flint, just because when I was an FT reporter and Doug was running HSBC, it's the kind of thing you go and say, okay, what happens when prices rise, when interest rates rise? And now I know, Douglas, you're the chair of Aberdeen, so you think, I suppose, about the impact on savings and investment. What do you think we're looking at in 2022?
Very good question. We think that 2022 in some ways will be a relatively benign year, largely on the basis that those people who came through the pandemic well, i.e. who had jobs that they were able to do from home, have actually ended up, as Liam said, with net savings, because they haven't been spending money on commuting and doing all the things after work they would normally do. And therefore, the people with firepower have got probably more than they would have expected to have, because their spending has been constrained. On the other hand, those that have been at the bottom end of society, low wage gig workers, are really very badly hit, because their income hasn't done very much, and their costs, food, heating, accommodation, and so on, has grown. I think one of the things I find very difficult in this whole discussion is that inflation is a bit like GDP. People in South Shields don't recognize UK GDP figures because they say that's not the GDP I've gotten, and inflation is across the country. It depends on where you live. It depends on what you consume. It depends on your age. I think that I agree completely with what Liam says, that older people have benefited hugely because they tend to be asset rich, and we've had a period of falling and then very low interest rates. And so anyone with assets has done incredibly well. Now, the reverse happens if interest rates start to rise. If you're a young person, in some respects, that's not a bad thing, because the impact of rising rates should mean that house prices will fall, and certainly in terms of your ability to take a multiple of your income and find things in reach, albeit that the funding costs of them have gone up, but you can now put down a deposit on something you couldn't otherwise afford. You will have that switch back to younger people. I think the bigger problem, and Liam and Vicky will be far more articulate on this than I can ever be, is you've got a challenge for central banks. If inflation is not transitory, and to be candid, I don't know anyone who thinks it is transitory. If inflation isn't transitory, then people lose confidence in the central bank's ability to forecast inflation. And of course, they have to say it's transitory, because if it's not, they should be moving interest rates. On the other hand, if it turns out not to be transitory, but interest rates continue to stay low because the central bank wants to do its role in protecting the economy, which is more of a mandate in the US than the UK, then people worry about the independence of the central bank. And then you are in the scenario that Liam worries about, that the markets begin to lose faith in the price maintenance mandate of the central bank because they're being incredibly political. I was sitting beside a director of one of Britain's top exporters, massive company, 2 weeks ago. He says inflation in his business is in the high teens. I mean, and the other thing I would say is the banks are flush with money, which is why interest rates are so low in mortgages, because it's the safest asset class you can buy, and therefore the most important thing is to get your money back. To me, that's why German interest rates are negative, because if you really worry about what could happen, you wouldn't want your money in the secondary economies of Europe, because you would worry about whether they would default on their bonds. So getting your money back, even not in real terms, is better than not getting your money back at all. And when we see politicians all the way around the world talking about Build Back Better and talking about the tens of trillions of dollars that need to be spent per annum over the next 20, 30 years to protect the world from climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., etc., etc. How can that be done without there being inflation? Right the way through supply chains, right the way through emerging markets, right the way through developed economies, as there is such a competition for all kinds of resources in short supply, whether it's commodities or labor. So I fear that we've got a short period of it's still okay as we spend the benefit for those that have been privileged enough to have jobs that they've been able to save from in the last 18 months. So for the next year, and then I think the rubber hits the road as economic forecasts for 23 and before are pretty anemic. And the benefit of saving will have gone away, and the inequality that exists today, I think, will only get worse in a rising interest rate in environment.
And what happens, Douglas, just one thing, on the investment side, presumably when there's just a good deal less money sloshing around, you don't have what someone described to me just now as the everything rally. It can't be the case that money's going into everything. Presumably investors get much more discerning. Some things crash, some things prosper.
Well, I think if interest rates were to rise, the growth stocks would struggle because there'd be less money, less money in the economy, and therefore those stocks that can only be justified if you put pretty extravagant growth rates on them, I think would disappear. If interest rates were to rise too, we have been in a period of financial repression, i.e., governments have been able to issue bonds at significantly less than inflation, and therefore this is something that could impact the older generation when they suddenly look at their savings that have been sort of put into bonds as they're in retirement phase, and therefore you're not investing in equities, you're investing in fixed income securities. A large portion of that will be in government bonds. If you've got a 20, 30-year government bond and interest rates go to 2-3%, your stated wealth will take quite a significant hit, and that could have an interesting political impact as people who sort of say, your regulation forced us to put more money into fixed income, long-term bonds. You issued them, we bought them. And now as interest rates have risen, the capital value of our savings is significantly lower. So, I mean, I think if we end up in an inflationary world, people will be spending more money on the things they need to consume to live. There will be less money in savings. The good news in a kind of a way, and it's double-edged, the good news in a kind of way is that the cost then of repairing pension fund deficits gets a little bit easier for companies because the rates at which they can invest is higher, but the ability of people to afford to put money away for their own retirement, and I think this is the other huge concern that government should have, that in a world of dealing with climate change, talking about social care, talking about the demographics of healthcare, the demographics of providing for pensions and is really increasingly democratized to the individual, and these people are not going to have money to put away for a rainy day, and that is building up a problem for 20 years time, which could be, you know, just like climate change, just like the health crisis.
Can I, Douglas, thank you. Can I come, Liam, I want to hear what you think about all of that. I just want to bring in a couple of other points of view. I want to bring in my colleague Liz, if I might, just on housing and how worried you are on about that, and my colleague Lara, who's just been talking about fear. Liz.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. I originally put in the chat that I'm terrified of interest rate rises. I'm absolutely terrified of it. My parents nearly lost their house in the 80s when interest rates just ran away. Well, our house, the house I lived in, and I have lived in fear of it ever since. As a consequence, I'm somebody who's owned a house through a period of historically low interest rates on a long-term fixed rate that was very uncompetitive. So I played it all wrong. So I am terrified of interest rate rises. But then after everybody has been speaking, I sort of thought about the political context again, and I just don't think anybody gets it. And I wonder if the reason why ordinary people, myself included, by the way, the fear feels real, but because in 2008 we were told the world nearly ended, and then Gordon Brown waved a magic wand and the quantitative easing fairy came and it all went away again. That was the point, I think, where a lot of ordinary people just gave up trying to understand.
Trying to understand it, you mean? Yeah.
How does this lever goes, and then what happens over here? And I think that it's much easier to blame rising prices on greedy companies. And it's, you know, people talk about gilts and asset prices. This doesn't mean anything to anybody. It just doesn't hit. And I know that when you go to the petrol station and it's £1.60 a gallon, and last week it's £1.40, you notice that. But I think that the degree to which, as a person, you would feel any degree of power from a voting perspective over how you would fix that problem is zero. And I think Liz, that's why people disengage.
But can I just say, just for us, I think that's our job here, because the thing that I remember feeling really distressed about after 2008-9 was hearing central bankers say the result of much lower interest rates is going to be much greater inequality. Even Christine Lagarde started talking about it. And I remember thinking, no one told me that. I had no idea that that's part of the deal, and that it was going to be a good deal for Greenwich, Connecticut, right, and a bad deal for anyone else who wasn't, working on Wall Street, and that wasn't explained. And I suppose that's my question here, and that's the reason why I think the point that kind of Liam and Douglas are making about, being kind of slightly dramatic about it, a pensions crisis, or an impact on pensioners is really, it's like, oh, no one's saying to us that that's the likely impact of kind of rising inflation. Sorry, Laura, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. I just want to hear what Liam, what you think of all this.
Well, I think we shouldn't lose sight of this fundamental point, which is that if we in the UK have got a persistently high long-term outlook for inflation, notwithstanding the great points Vicky makes, and I agree with those, but at some point you do risk the wage anchors beginning to snap. Now, we have a pretty casualized labour market.
The wage anchor, sorry, Liam, being the relationship.
The wage anchors in that people will start asking for pretty significant increases in wages. And I think, you can easily see how in certain sectors, construction, transportation, that is definitely already happening. When I talk to bricklayers in Shard End, they are definitely charging more. The Polish HGV driver I spoke to on Friday has just gone from 13 quid an hour to 20 quid an hour. So there are sort of particular sectors where you've got wage spikes already beginning to come up. If you've got persistently high inflation, then you may well see that sectoral wide. But I think in many ways the politics, and that's obviously bad for central bank credibility, and people worry about economic competence, and that riff unfolds. But the rubber hits the road in terms of politics, in terms of pensions and taxes. So if you are a pensioner and you've done the right thing all your life and you've saved hard, and you basically see your pension go up by £4.25, which is what happens next April. But you're on a fixed income and you just can't buy quite what you used to be able to buy. then you start getting pretty concerned about whether your pension is going up fast enough, and you hold the government to account for that. Equally, if you're a working family and you've got flat wages, you've got rising prices, and you've got the biggest tax increase since the 1950s coming through, then all of a sudden you're thinking, hang on a minute, I'm not sure the government quite understands the way my life is at the moment. So in terms of how that really swings the polls, by far and away the biggest impact will be if the over 55s start leaving the Conservative Party. That is when you basically get a shift in the tectonic plates of the country.
And just stick with that for a second, Liam, because one of the arguments about Corbyn's Labour Party was not about the policies or politics, but the demographic calculation, i.e. winning over young people wasn't enough to win. Do you think that Starmer...
there's just not enough young people to do that. I mean, the single most important fact in British politics is that Labour loses the over 65s by 3 million. It's not a bit, it's 3 million. A lot of the debate that you see in the papers is, has Labour got a working class problem? But actually, Labour wins the working age vote narrowly. We lose the over 65s by 3 million.
So you think inflation puts the over 65s in play for Labour?
Yeah, I do, because I spent a bit of time as the shadow older people's minister, or whatever we called it, a few years ago, and just sitting down with pensioners, going through the rigor with which they know their bills, with which they know their outgoings. If they've got a little bit of debt that they carry into old age as well, then the terror levels just rise. There's just a real fear that when you live on a fixed income, if prices are going up, you're just not going to be able to make it to the end of the week or the end of the month in the way that you once were. And yet you feel aggrieved about that, because very often you'd have done the right thing all your life and paid your stamp. You thought you'd be protected and be safeguarded against this kind of risk. So that can have a pretty significant political impact on a very significant group of voters.
So, Liam, I'm going to come back to that in a second. But Laura, you were saying at a different end of it, fear.
Yeah, I'm saying as a much less significant member of a much less voting demographic that it's strange, because for my so far short adult life, inflation really hasn't been a problem. Rates been low, but on the other side of that, it is such a far-flung possibility to so many people in my generation, the prospect of owning a own home or caring about, pretty elusive for many people, savings, that I think it hadn't so far been a particularly potent sort of political issue for many people my age. I do think that in this particular political climate, with the cost of living crisis such as it is, with possible changes to how student debt will be working, with changes to taxes that have been mentioned, and I think with the whole social care debate bringing the question of demography into this kind of these issues around the social contract, that this issue of inflation could actually become quite a political threat for this government. I do think, though, that I thought that before I just heard Liam speak, and actually it's making me think again just how insanely powerless my generation is as a political force, and I think it's very unlikely that you'll be seeing young people on the streets as a result of inflation soon. So this is the first time I've been feeling fearful about something like this, and I'm sure that's a large part of privilege, but I'm not particularly hopeful that people my age are going to be able to do much about it. James.
Laura, thank you. Can I go from one thing, which is the sort of democratic politics, to the institutional politics for a moment, and just, Vicky, go back to you, if I might, on this point that Douglas made about confidence in central bankers and central banks. My experience of central bankers is that we revere them until we decided that they were idiots and everything they did was rubbish. And so, if you look at kind of Alan Greenspan had that, you'll remember. And I wonder whether or not we're about to witness the same thing, which is, Jay Powell has just been renominated. We're saying that these central banks have done an amazing job in flushing money through the system, in sustaining us all through the pandemic. And yet, are we about to look back and say, they allowed this asset purchase scheme to run far too long, they put too much liquidity in, and as a result, they let inflation get away from them, and then they could never quite catch up?
The first thing to remember is that they put all this money in order to ensure that the governments that they were supporting, if you like, with their own monetary policy, or the economies they were supporting, or the governments they were supporting, if you want to say that, even though they were independent, were able to indeed borrow in the markets to put this stimulus into the economy. So it wasn't necessarily that it's the central bankers that just, you know, put all this money into the economy to get it all to work. It was because it's somehow or other the governments, the fiscal authorities, were putting this huge stimulus packages into the economy, huge. In the case of the US, about 15% of GDP, in our case, about 12% of GDP during this crisis, in order to get the economy moving. And QE, quantitative easing, used extensively then, but also, of course, it had been tried and it worked following the financial crisis, has been absolutely essential in getting the economy moving. I know we're now worrying about inequality. You can use the tax system to sort out inequality if that's what you want.
I suppose
I was going to say that without what happened, we would not have had the recovery. Remember, we had deflation at the beginning, not just oil prices. We had deflation at the beginning of the crisis, and we had deflation at various stages during the financial crisis as well. We would not have had the growth or the improvement in employment we are seeing, which is now, of course, leading to this demand, which is increasing wages of workers, including construction workers, manufacturing workers, workers in hospitality areas, in the retail sector, and so on. So, you know, before we attack central bankers for this, we need to bear that in mind. There's one very quick point I want to make. You said about what we thought about the central bankers in the past and how wonderful they had been, and we all thought they were great. The truth is they have an inflation target, and that inflation target has been very easy to meet during globalization because we had all these cheap inputs from China and everything else. So it isn't that they did anything great. It just so happens that we had growth and we had low inflation because of globalization. The one thing that would worry me about the future, and your initial question about is this transitory or not, if we go back on that, all this talk of onshoring, you know, cutting all these supply chains that are there that actually allow all this relatively cheap stuff to come in. And I think Douglas Flint was right when he was talking about the increased cost of net zero. This will be one of them. The moment we start, as we probably will and perhaps should, have proper carbon prices and control comes into our borders. So we are in for higher prices for a while. But I would not blame personally the central bankers for having done what they had to do to keep within the targets, if you like, in the longer term, and also get the economies moving.
I suppose, Vicky, I probably didn't frame it right entirely in that I suppose there's the blaming, or if you like, the concern around economists and central bankers is that they've taken too long, or they've sat too long with the argument that this inflation is transitory, when more and more people say, you know what, it is going to get baked in for all the reasons that, you know, you say and Douglas just mentioned. There's a different institutional politics question, though, that I've got for you, Vicky, which is when Gordon Brown and when Tony Blair moved into Downing Street in 1997, and then within a matter of days, Gordon Brown announced the independence of the Bank of England, this was thought of as a wonderful thing. And to an extent, I feel as though I've lived for a generation in which it's been a wonderful thing, partly because the interests of the Treasury haven't that obviously been at odds with the interests of the central bank. Now, though, there's quite a strong argument that says the central bank has got to try and do something about inflation, but the Treasury has good reasons to really worry about growth. And so there is a tension between the two, isn't there?
Oh, perhaps, of course, you've got to remember that in the latest budget, at the end of October, Rishi Sunak said, I've written to the governor of the Bank of England this morning to remind him he had to keep inflation low and on target, or something like that, stable and on target, something like that, which of course, you know, I found it quite odd, given that the bank is indeed meant to be independent, as you rightly said. But it is also worth bearing in mind that the bank, because of the way in which things were set up in 97, actually got rid of quite a lot of its functions for a while. And it was one of the reasons, I think, why we got the financial crisis as bad as we did get it, because nobody was really looking at sort of financial stability very much any longer. And now, of course, it's got all these other duties back. So the Bank of England isn't just there to ensure that, you know, we keep that target there. It's also to ensure that we have some sort of stability in the financial system overall. So one has to also be careful worrying about the banks. Certainly, at the initial stages of the crisis, there was a very big worry about what would happen to a financial system at the beginning of the pandemic crisis, I mean. And they had to help that as well. So they have duties along those lines. So the Treasury wants to have growth, but of course you can't have growth when you have a system, a financial system that perhaps was on the verge of collapse, frankly. So they're not really working in a dissimilar ways, is really what I meant to say.
Vicky, thank you. I just want to go back to Jack. Jack's, sorry, because when I talk about this kind of institutional politics, there's a risk that we get far away from people. How worried are you that we don't have a political mindset in government that can address the issues of working families living in an inflationary environment? What do you think they need?
From an institutional perspective?
Yeah, from as in, if you were sort of writing the Treasury playbook, Liam at the top talks about the kind of instinctive fear Treasury has around a gilt strike, running out of money, borrowing too much. But if you take it from the other perspective, which is look at the people who are going to be in need as a result of inflation, what should the Treasury playbook read like? So,
I mean, I think the kind of simple answer is that there's not very much that the Treasury can do about a global inflation and this kind of longer-term thing. What it can do is ameliorate the effects where they kind of have a material effect on living standards. So, you know, the Treasury could have ramped up cold weather payments to target poorer families who are facing, you know, rapidly rising energy bills. You know, there are things like that that absolutely could have been done. And, you know, we did see some, you know, it's not like there weren't some things that the change to the taper rate in universal credit will help some working families kind of more at the top end of the kind of the people who are on universal credit income. It's a slightly weird thing of sort of there were winners and losers within universal credit as a result of that. But, you know, there were some things that were done. I think it could have gone a lot further. And I think, you know, a lot of that is the politics of kind of who is being helped and when, and the kind of what that kind of looks like to in a kind of broader narrative for the government is I think you know, difficult. But, you know, in the kind of broader institutional framework, we don't have, you know, there isn't a kind of an independent, you know, body that's going, well, you know, the people who are the poorest 20% of people in the country are suffering in X ways, and so you need to be sort of moving a lever in the Treasury. That's not just kind of how it's set up. So that it requires kind of that active the active kind of process of a broader society to kind of highlight where people are kind of suffering, I think.
Jack, thank you. I'm gonna play it. Liam, I'm gonna play it back to you at the end, because I wondered whether or not you could try and draw a line from 2008-9 to where we are in 21-22. And my question really is this, is that in the end, New Labour was not finished off by Iraq. It wasn't finished off by Tony Blair versus Gordon Brown. You could well argue that it was finished off by the global financial crisis and a loss of reputation for economic competence. And I wonder whether or not you think that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are much more threatened by inflation and what that might do to their reputation for economic competence than many of the other things that people often think are going to do them in.
I mean, I think they're going to be threatened by inflation because Conservative political economy for the last 10 years has been based on building the grey vote. So, you know, it helps to follow the money. I mean, if you just look at the scale of fiscal transfers to older voters over the last 10 years, I mean, it is eye-watering. And I think, you know, when I looked at the Rishi Sunak's last budget, I think about 60%, James will correct me, 60% of the scorecard, so the scorecard is the bit that summarises all the tax and spending measures, most of the money that was being spent was going to older voters. So, this has been a really carefully constructed political economy. We've been Conservatives for the last kind of 10 years. Our economy in the UK is very consumption driven, and increasingly it has been consumption driven by older voters, and that has been fueled by these massive fiscal transfers to older voters. If you've now got older voters beginning to get really alarmed about what is going to happen to their living standards, then that is a big shift in the tectonic plates of British politics. The one point I just think that we're perhaps missing from the debate over the last 10 years is the debate about productivity, which of course has been hopeless over the last 10 years. We have now the most centralized state pretty much in my political time. We have a terrible centralization of decisions over skills, over transport, over housing, over infrastructure. And actually we've just not had the productivity performance that has allowed us to put up wages in a good way, in the way that we could over the last 10 years. So I think, one of the reasons that we go into this inflation anxiety with a living standards crisis is because frankly, George Osborne tried to take a lot of shortcuts in the austerity program that he put in place over the last 10 years.
Liam, thank you. On that note, which invites a whole political debate of itself, I'm going to have to draw things to a close. Can I just say a couple of things before I say a thank you? One is, I really like a conversation which takes me in the place that I didn't see coming at all, and I should have thought much more about inflation and pensions and the prospect of a real cut in living standards for pensioners. There seemed to me both a public sector pensions issue there and a private savings issue around pensions from Douglas, and the combination of both of those things and the impact on the grey vote and the impact then on Labour versus Tory strategy feels like a really rich scene for us to think about. I'm aware that we probably left kind of too much ground uncovered on house prices and mortgages. I was interested in Kim's question at the end there, which was, could a central bank deliberately try to move house prices, and would that be something to the good? I know that my colleague Matt Dancona, who's kind of really helped me think about the generation gap, often comes back to this point about what's reasonable to expect as someone in their 20s and 30s today versus 25 years ago. I do think this point that Vicky and Douglas talked about, which is confidence in the central banks, were they, Vicky, to your point, kind of lucky central bankers, like lucky generals, to have lived through globalization, and they're not as therefore stressed on inflation. But Douglas, your point, which is, if you start losing confidence in central bank predictions on inflation, does that mean that if, in effect, kind of wage negotiations go haywire? That feels like a big and meaningful conversation. And then the fourth element, which I suppose we need to look at, is growth and the extent to which these changes in the taper, the changes in interest rates, will have an impact on growth. All of which against the background, obviously, of Omicron uncertainty and supply chain problems. So it does feel, Lara, to be fair, that this is not entirely a bad time to be economically a little bit tense, if not actually fearful. And so I feel as though it's done what I hope this hour would do, force us to think beyond just the kind of RPI, CPI numbers. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for those people who came in and joined us in the chat or in the conversation, but a big thank you to Jack Leslie, to Vicky Price, and to Liam Byrne. Please do join us again. I suspect this isn't the last conversation we're going to have on this subject. Thank you very much indeed, and see you soon.